Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Like all radio studios, the one we're sitting in now has been deliberately constructed to dampen echoes and cut out extraneous sound, which means it's a drab sort of space for the acoustic engineer Trevor Cox, author of Sonic Wonderland. His quest for the world's most reverberant space has taken him into disused reservoirs and into underground oil bunkers, all part of a campaign to get us to pay more attention to the subtleties of our sonic landscape. His research into resonance and silence should generate an echo, though, from two of my other guests. The composer Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, whose 10th Symphony receives its premiere next Sunday, and the lecturer in music psychology Victoria Williamson, whose new book is about the ways in which music can shape us and the way our minds shape music. Also with us, the art critic Waldemar Januszak, whose television series Rococo argues that it's not all frills and froth. We begin, though, with one of the country's most distinguished composers, Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, Master of the Queen's Music, and you're about to premiere your 10th Symphony, which is a kind of very significant milestone in any composer's life, but particularly because of the curse of the ninth. I don't know whether you subscribe to that superstition, but you could be excused for doing it because you fell very, very ill last year, didn't you?
Well, this was extraordinary. I never thought about the curse of the ninth, and I had the idea for number 10, which was going to be played, I knew, the 2nd of February this year, and I was determined I was going to finish it. And then suddenly, last March, April, I became very ill and collapsed in the street, and life was very difficult. So I decided, very unusually, to go to see the doctor. And I couldn't believe it. They said, you've got to go to hospital now because you've got leukemia. Otherwise, you've got 6 weeks. So I went into the hospital, and while I was there, I wrote most of the symphony. So that, if there is a curse of 9, that's one way of getting beyond it.
Well, you've magnificently defeated it, but I'm interested in the process. You must have been writing at a time when you were exhausted, when you were feeling ill. How did that feed into the music you wrote? Did you feel?
I hope not. I was determined to get up whenever I could with the dreadful chemotherapy and be at that table at 7 o'clock in the morning working. And I just had this huge determination.
But there wasn't a sense of mortality that affected how you wrote or changed?
It's not really for me to say. And of course the subject of the symphony is the architect Borromini, who if you know anything about Rome, you will know.
I'm just going to move. You've got the score with you, and I'm just going to move it because it's tapping the microphone, which doesn't make me anxious, but makes them very anxious through the glass.
Anyway, I decided to write this symphony on Borromini, and I set in it for the chorus this dreadful anonymous sonnet against him. It's all in Italian. I thought with Papano conducting, and he's going to take it to Rome subsequently. So I thought, let's keep it all in the original Italian. And there's this wonderful, scurrilous sonnet against Borromini, accusing him of doing architecture which is against art and against nature. And who does he think he is? He thinks he's Bernini, but he's only fit to be a labourer on a site for Bernini.
Now, I know the critic doesn't get the last word in this piece, does he? Because you end with a litany of Borromini's churches, the great masterpieces that have survived.
It finishes with Borromini's suicide note. He tried to commit suicide. It didn't work. He fell on his sword, and so he lived for 2 more days and dictated a kind of last testament, which I've set a part of, and it's very moving. And I think he was genuinely a very disturbed introvert man who was desperately upset because Bernini got all the best commissions. And I set that for the soloist, the baritone soloist, and against that I've got the chorus chanting the names of the wonderful buildings that he either built himself or he had a hand in Rome, so that it finishes very quietly with the unaccompanied chorus, but on a positive note. This is the legacy. Isn't it wonderful, is the last sentiment.
The triumph of art. It's very interesting that you've been so inspired by Borromini. There's that famous quote ascribed to Goethe. I don't know whether he actually said it. Architecture is frozen music.
Yes.
He's supposed to have said. Do you agree? And is the reverse true? Is music a kind of mobile architecture?
It's hard to say, because I've loved architecture ever since I was a student in Rome. I first went there in 1955, and I was shown by an architect friend these wonderful buildings, and I immediately fell in love with Borromini, because he has this absolutely wonderful gift to be able to make a small space seem very large, with multiple dimensions, with almost as if there are different vanishing points in the building. And it reminds me in a strange way of Piranesi in some of his views of Rome, where he has different vanishing points, but even more so those extraordinary fantasies about prisons, where there are multiple vanishing points in the engraving. And I think it's very, very inspiring. And
did it inspire you in an impressionistic way, or are there more structural things that go into the symphony which are a reflection of what you see in Borromini?
Yes, there are actually arithmetical things based on the proportions, but I think one must always remember that in architecture there are lines which can be measured. In music, it's always on a curve, because your perception of the music changes depending upon your heartbeat and the emotional state you're in at that moment. So you can't make direct transferences from one medium into another in that kind of way.
Yes, but you have a kind of framework, a mental framework that you're using.
A mental framework, and a rigorous sequence of numbers relating to the proportions in the Borromini, particularly the great church San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane.
And did the acoustics of those churches enter your mind at all as you were working on this?
I had recently a performance of another work I wrote, a string quartet on Borromini, in a church there, and that was in the Sant'Agnese in Piazza Navona. And the acoustic was wonderful for that string quartet, and I had that sound echoing in my mind while I was writing this. But if you go to Santivo at the university there, the acoustic in there is impossible. You can't hear anything because the echo is too big. How they can do anything in there with any sound at all, I don't know.
Well, that's your cue, Trevor Cox, isn't it? You know all about this stuff.
Yeah, I guess so. And actually, they've found in scientific studies there's people who like that echoiness, like that reverberance. There's people who don't. When they've tested people's preference for concert halls, they find some people want to hear the detail and want clarity, and some people split into another group who just want what you'd describe as a mush.
The very interesting thing in your book about the way in which the Reformation changes the acoustic of churches, because it becomes more important for the voice to be heard, and once the reverberations are dampened, Bach comes along and he says, right, I've got to write a different kind of music now, because I can actually get more, to put it at its most crude, I can get more notes in now.
Yes, if you have a very reverberant Gothic church, the notes run into each other in a way that makes it, it comes into this unintelligible mush, which you can either accept and let this sort of this smog rise up, or you have to play slower. So what Bach was able to do when Thomas Kirk in Leipzig was altered, he came along a little while later and he could write faster music, so he could write all his great works.
Valdemar, I know you had an experience while you were filming your series Rococo, didn't
That's
you?
That's
right.
Of
going into a Rococo church in this case, obviously.
That's true, yes. I went into Wieskirche and somebody was playing some Bach. It's got a huge organ in there. And to be honest, it's one of the reasons I made the series, because during the research this happened, and I was literally unable to move in that church because the organ was somehow vibrating right through me. And I had in art they called it the Stendhal syndrome, don't they, where you actually feel you're going to faint. And I had that in that church because the organ music was so physical. It sort of vibrated through me, and then this marvellous Rococo church rising above me with all these billowing clouds and these views of heaven. It was absolutely an ecstatic and physical experience.
Well, there is something about that moment, isn't there, when your body actually resonates, because you have you have effectively a sound chamber, don't you? You have your lungs, which will resonate with certain sounds. Victoria Williamson.
Absolutely, and the physical sensations that people experience are often described in psychological terms as chills. This experience of hair standing on the end, shivers down the spine, and these actually have a recognisable and unique brain signature. This is stimulation of the very deep and very ancient reward centres of the brain, which react in other studies to stimuli that are evolutionary good for us. And we don't really yet understand why music that really touches us in this way physically can stimulate those ancient brain areas, but there must be something about music that has stimulated a sense of reward and motivation in humans for a very long time.
So Peter, I'm sure you get that experience listening to other people's music. Do you get it when you're composing?
I can absolutely underline this with red ink. Yes. When you're, particularly, I spent many years conducting orchestras all over the place, and conducting, you feel that the music is playing you, and your body is very much a part of it, and there's no difference at all between you, your body, and the actual music. It plays you, quite literally. And when you're writing music, of course, that experience of being physically involved is there with you all the time. And it's, at least you look as if you're being very quiet, just writing on a piece of paper with a pencil. But there's this huge tumult going on inside you, and your heart goes with it. And I'm sure it's...
you have a physical effect.
It's so physical.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Trevor Cox, you've been, I think this will be music to your ears, really, because your book, Sonic Wonderland, is trying to get people to pay more attention to noises, to the pleasures of noise, to the subtleties of noise. You set out essentially to track down some of the sonic wonders of the world, and you started with reverberant spaces like churches and so on, and went on a hunt for the most reverberant space. You found it, didn't you? Where did you eventually located?
Right nearly in the top of Scotland, near Inverness, there's some old oral storage depots which were used. They were dug in the 1930s and 40s to protect them from bombing in World War II. So they're actually in the side of a Scottish hillside above the Cromarty Firth. And they're just these vast concrete caverns. You go into these, it's like entering a sort of James Bond lair down these concrete tunnels. And actually getting into the tanks is a bit of performance because there's no doors. They weren't designed to get into. You actually have to go through the pipes. So the pipes are 18 inches, about 45 centimetres in diameter. And you lie on this trolley, which is a bit like, you get pushed through these pipes, a bit like a pizza being pushed into an oven. And you can feel it pushing against your shoulders to get through. I mean, I could fit through, but if I was a big bloke, you might struggle. And then you get into this, what's the size of a cathedral, but it's just this huge concrete, vast arch tunnel, really. And it has, if you talk in there, your voice will last a minute before it dies away.
We can probably, I think we've got a recording of you actually setting off a gunshot or something so that you could actually record, the reverberation. Let's listen to that and you can tell us about it later. Now, we've cut off. I can still hear it actually in my headphones still going on, but it goes on for an astonishing length of time.
Yeah, that record is about a minute and 20 seconds. And in fact, the funny thing is that people asked me for this impulse response, and a few people have sent me back and said, you realise you stopped it a bit early. So the microphone was still picking up low frequency rumbles going on, and my hearing could no longer hear it. It had gone below my threshold of hearing. We were measuring it with a starting pistol because we wanted to prove it was the world's largest space. So we were measuring it according to an ISO standard that we'd normally use in concert halls. And it's quite commonly done. If you want to measure a concert hall quick, you get a starting pistol out because you want to make a big bang and see how the sound reflects around the space.
Yeah, you've also toured the world with balloons, popping balloons in tourist sites, and as well. And that's the other method, isn't it, that you used?
Yeah, I mean, the oil tanks were just so vast, the balloon probably wouldn't have been powerful enough, so we got a gun out. But yeah, no, I've got quite a penchant for getting sort of the balloons out in various strange places, under arches in, around the industrial heritage of Manchester was the last one I was doing.
Is your hearing particularly refined now? Because I went out on a sound walk, encouraged by you, turned off my iPod and just listened to everything, clapped underneath bridges, shouted underneath bridges, and I could get a little bit of it, but your hearing seems very acute. You can tell, for example, if a sound is spiralling down a tunnel. I don't even know what that would sound like.
Well, I think you'd have to go down and find a tunnel which it does it, and it's quite unusual. Where I met it was in a sewer. So I wouldn't recommend going into a sewer, by the way, because it's fairly foul. But yeah, that's why I heard that. That's the only time I've heard that sound effect. But is my hearing particularly acute? Probably not, because we all actually do pretty sophisticated hearing tasks all the time. Actually, this conversation is using lots of our brain powers. When we listen to music, there's vast amounts of our brain are used to process what's going on. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is just pay attention to what's around, rather than saying I've got particularly sensitive hearing. All I'm doing is paying attention to it rather than ignoring it.
I was astonished by one fact I learned from your book, which is that the quietest noises we hear, the bones of the middle ear, are moving by 1,000th of the width of a hydrogen atom. Tiny, tiny. So it's a fantastically sensitively calibrated instrument, this, isn't it?
Yeah, if it was any more sensitive, all it would hear would be noise. It would just be sort of, vibrations of the structures. There's no point in having any more sensitive. And of course, our hearing goes up to tremendously loud noises as well. And we have a tremendously sensitive hearing organ, which our brain is continually tweaking to try and make it work as best as it can.
So it's adapting it to the conditions in which it finds itself.
That's one of the funny things when you go into a silent room, is you hear this hissing sound, which is actually spontaneous firings on your auditory nerve. And that's actually because your ear is trying to turn the gain up in an effort to hear something and can't find anything. A bit like when you turn up a microphone, you suddenly hear the electronic hiss. So, yeah, it's adapting all the time.
It's enormously emotionally subjective too, isn't it? I was struck by some of the stories you tell in your book about the ways in which people interpret sound, and how they feel about it entirely alters how they respond to it.
Yes, I suppose something which is highly researched is noise. If you live near Heathrow Airport and you're having a fly past, is that a problem or not to you? It might depend on whether you work at the airport or not. You might feel a bit less annoyed by it if actually your daily income is dependent on the aircraft noise. So yeah, our relationship is very, very contextual. Depends on what we've experienced before, which is very important in music, of course, what we know about music, and also how do we feel about that sound source? Are we fearful of it? That changes our impression of it.
It reminded me, actually, I think they once did research in New York in one of the little plaza parks, which had a waterfall feature, and they went and asked the people why they were sitting there, and they said, well, it's lovely, it's peaceful. I come here at lunchtime because it's so peaceful. They measured it. The decibel level of the waterfall was louder than the traffic noise nearby, but they just assumed it was a natural noise, therefore they felt calmed by it. Some of your sonic wonders are not man-made, aren't they? A lot of them respond to kind of structures, but then you've got the shifting dunes, the singing dunes, which are a remarkable feature.
Yes, there's about 30, 40 dunes in the world which have been documented to actually hum and drone, and they sound a bit like a taxiing aircraft. And these can be really loud. They can be heard sort of kind of a mile away. And Charles Darwin, Marco Polo wrote about them. They've been known for some time, and I went into the Mojave Desert in California to experience them for myself and to slide down the dunes and create this drone.
And it succeeded eventually.
Yeah, day one was a bit of a damp squib, but to be honest, we because travel a large distance into the heat of the desert. You have to go there in the summer, so incredibly hot, and they just wouldn't work the first day. We had these pathetic recordings, but day two, we sort of recalibrated and we managed to find out the best place.
You were talking earlier about the subjectivity of how people respond to concert halls, and some people like different things. Is that governed by fashion as well? Do we have other long-form fashions in how we like to listen to our music?
Well, certainly concert halls have evolved over time. The typical concert hall used for classical music hasn't changed very much. But, if we go back to, say, a Baroque time, then people weren't performing in the same spaces they're performing in now. So music has evolved as it's changed, as its purpose has changed. It's now a place, big symphony music is, performed in a concert hall where we have a couple of thousand people listening. It's a typical kind of venue.
Peter, you knew a year ago that you were going to go into the Barbican, and you know that space kind of hourly. You're composing specifically for that acoustic, are you? Or taking it into account?
You take it into account, and I think that one reason that I live in Orkney, right by the sea, is because the soundscape there is just so wonderful, and I take 2 or 3 long walks with the dog along the shore every day, and the sound is always wonderful, and it's always so different. And I realise that complete silence can be very disturbing. I got that in Antarctica when I wrote my Antarctic Symphony. I had to go there as a condition. Of course, I loved it, but I had never been so utterly surprised by the sound of my own body working, which was quite extraordinary and very off-putting too.
Well, it is. I once went to Joshua Tree Monument Park in California and heard my own blood pulsing through my veins.
Yes,
and absolutely, you think, what is that strange noise? You can hear birds flying over as well, which rather suggests that we're acutely aware.
Yes,
but it's all kind of crowded out mostly by noise and indeed music.
Absolutely. One of the fascinating things about the hearing system, everybody knows that we have neurons going from the ear up to the brain. Not many people appreciate how many we have going the other way. So we have these feedback neurons coming into the ear. And what happens as somebody learns to listen to music or learns to perform as a musician is those feedback pathways, they get trained. So Professor Nina Kraus has coined this music for a smarter ear, this feedback system that Trevo was referring to, which can be thought of as attention, but it's below our conscious level. The brain is tuning in your ears specifically for different sounds, learning all the time.
It's learning, but then it's also sort of altering what you hear in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. These are messages coming down from the brain, so they will be flooded with what we call top-down influences, so memories and emotions, and that's why so Peter was saying that you can experience different emotions in different pieces at different times.
Your book, You Are the Music, is about that whole process. It's about, I suppose, the question of whether music shapes us or whether we shape music. It's a bit of both, I take it.
Yes, that's a good evaluation. It started out purely as me wanting to tell the story of how we become musical. For many years, I've studied people who were born tone deaf, people with congenital amusia, and it seemed to me that there was a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of music. The musician is somebody who stands in a tuxedo and performs, when in fact people are incredibly musical, and even people who have congenital amusia can find something to love in music.
It's a very small proportion, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people will say, oh, I'm tone deaf or I don't know anything, but in fact the proportion of people who neurologically have a real problem with music is only like 4% of the population.
Absolutely. Yeah, if anything, the 4% is probably a slight overestimate. I mean, but everybody will know somebody who can't carry a tune in a bucket, but that's most of the time simply a function of singing ability, and that can be trained.
Yeah. You start with a very a kind of rather famous anecdote about the effect of music on the mind, which is the Mozart effect, this popular notion that if you play Mozart to babies in the womb and indeed in their cradles, they'll end up smarter. A lot of hot-housing parents try to do this. A lot of people sold a lot of kit to enable them to do it. It doesn't quite work, does it?
It doesn't quite work, no. I mean, the Mozart effect, you can trace its roots back to a single one-page study that came out in 1993. And the two things that are quite interesting about it is, firstly, it had absolutely nothing to do with babies or children. It was a study with students, normal psychology study, just take the nearby students and test them. And the other thing was that this was always a temporary effect on a particular paper cutting and folding task, but it's been extrapolated and blown up over the years to be an effect of a particular composer on our intelligence. A simple answer to a complex problem. Listen to music and you'll get smarter. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way.
OK, how does it work? Because you go on to say that there are definite recordable effects that follow from listening to music and indeed playing it and learning to play it.
Well, there are very different effects. So there's very little evidence that just listening for a long time will have a measurable effect on somebody's cognitive ability or emotional response. It will certainly have temporary effects on your emotional state, on your state of what we call psychophysiological arousal, how awake you're feeling. But the real measurable effects on people's ability to read, on people's ability to hear in noise, these all come from active music making.
So it's actually the process of making it that alters the brain permanently and kind of fixes neurological structures in your brain. Because you say you can tell the brain of a musician just by looking at it with a magnifying glass.
Yes, that was done at the turn of the 20th century, actually, that 5 famous musicians of the time left their brain to science, and a surgeon, Sigmund Auerbach, looked at their brains and could see with a magnifying glasses the difference between them. Of course, the question is, were those differences there to start with, or did the music cause that? And that's a question that's hard to resolve without.
Yes, I think we may have some ethical
studies.
Problems in working that one out eventually.
Yes, it is difficult. Actually, there has been one study that has looked at a group of children and scanned their brains before they either chose to take music lessons or not. So you can't force children one way or the other, but if they choose, you can scan groups who opt for music and who don't, and showing no difference beforehand. And then after about 6 months, you start to see the sorts of changes, particularly in the auditory and motor areas of the brain, that we recognise as being different in adult professional musicians.
One of the questions, you talk about the pleasures of music and the various theories about why we take such pleasure in music. Very often they're to do with a culturally learned expectation. That, for example, the expectation effect, we know how the pulse of a piece of music is going, and the composer can play with that, can arrest a beat, can make us wait for something and then deliver it. Is there also physiological? I mean, after all, we live for 9 months in the womb with a steady beat, so presumably there is something in us that responds to pulse, to rhythm.
Absolutely. So studies have shown that 2-3 day babies, even when they're asleep, you can get a response in their brain signature that indicates that they are detecting a beat. And that is something that scientists have so far failed to replicate in some of our closest ape cousins. But as you said, quite rightly, there's 9 months, at least 3 or 4 months of exposure to sound that a fetus gets. And they're hearing through the fluid-filled womb the musical sounds of the environment. They're missing a lot of the high frequencies, so the fine detail. They're hearing melodies, they're hearing rhythms, especially related to their mother.
And they do have memories of those, because the research has been done to show that they respond to a tune they've heard before birth.
Absolutely. And that is, when people ask me, is there any benefit to playing baby's music in the womb, I say, well, there's no evidence you're going to make a smarter baby, but one thing I can think would be very useful is that you can take advantage of this memory. So if you always play the same piece of music when you're very relaxed in your last trimester of pregnancy, they have shown that when babies are then born, if they hear that music, they will show a relaxation response.
You write very interestingly about earworms as well, because the final bit of your book is about memory and music and these rather odd paradoxes, which is that it takes us a while to learn a piece of music, but once we have, it seems virtually inerasable, so that even people with Alzheimer's will be able to recover full pieces of music when a lot of their other working memory has gone. Is there any, and they're still researching, is there any sense of why that happens?
Well, since we're talking about architecture, the way we create a musical memory, I often use an architectural metaphor, which is actually the first time we hear a piece of music, our memory for it is pretty terrible. We're attracted by the very surface features. You could say the rococo. You're attracted by the frills, by the sounds. Your attention is pulled all over the place, and your memory is pretty poor. But as you hear the piece over time, you start to build a structure. You start to understand how the piece moves, and your mind plays with the expectations. It lays down the memory. And this all happens just by listening. You don't have to consciously do anything except listen to this piece of music. And you will, as you say, create this extremely strong memory that can survive in conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia, probably because these memory centres, these emotion centres of the brain are so deep and tend to last later into the stages of such conditions.
Peter Maxwell Davies, are you afflicted by earworms, by these persistent tunes? Or is that why you live in the Orkneys?
You could say that's one good reason for living away from persistent earworms which do get into your head, and they cause trouble because so often I'll be thinking something through, walking through the street or whatever, and you go into a bar or you go into a restaurant and it's completely blotted out because there's muzak playing, and I find that very irritating indeed. Usually,
and does it stick? Does it stick like a burr?
No, the ones that stick are the ones I'm working on.
Oh well, that's good.
Going round and round in my head.
Are you subject to earworms, Valdemar?
I am, yes, and an interesting thing. My daughters have all done music. You know, it was used to be thought of as a good way of getting into good schools, wasn't it? If you had a music a pass or two on your record. And a lot of pieces of music that they played, I got to know far better through hearing them constantly rehearsing the damn things, and got to love them profoundly. And it helped me immensely in my musical education, was hearing my daughters practicing this stuff. So I think this business of knowing things through a kind of a repetitive learning, I mean, it was really proved to me by that. I'm a terrible one for earworms. I hear them all the time.
Trevor Cox.
Well, I play the soprano saxophone, and I think my wife would disagree about this repetitive practice being a good idea, because I sort of trying to learn fairly technical classical saxophone, and I can tell you the repetitive nature of it is driving my family nuts.
There is something peculiarly moving, though, about hearing a piece played wrong and then played right. Some of my most profound musical experiences have been at school concerts, where you endure, less than perfect playing, and then suddenly for a bar or two, everything comes right, and it's as though the sun has come out, which I suppose is cultural expectation.
Particularly if it's your children playing, I think.
Well, yes, that doesn't always happen. Valdemar, I'm going to turn to you, where we're going to talk about the Rococo. You are a contrarian, I think I would describe you.
Thank you.
You've never come across a received opinion without wanting to give it a good clip round the ear, and you've taken on a pretty tough one with Rococo. It is the art movement that most people like to dismiss as frivolous, but your television series says that's wrong. Now, what's the basic argument there?
Well, yes, you're right. I'm a contrarian in the sense that if people say something to me, I tend to think, well, why is that true? Why isn't the opposite true? And it is true that Rococo tends to be looked down on. I mean, in musical terms, for example, things that I would have thought of as quintessential sort of Rococo type of music, such as bits of Bach, bits of Mozart, they don't get called that, do they? They're thought of as Baroque, and then they become classical. There is no Rococo in classical music, and yet, if you actually listen to it, it bears many of the qualities that Rococo art has. It's light, it's airy, it can be played quickly without enormous reverberation. If Rembrandt is kind of big reverb, then someone like Fragonard is very short reverb, and it just works in a different way. So it's a musical with an art that offers a different kind of pleasure. And that interested me. I mean, I just believe there's always great art being made all the time, and that must have been true of the Rococo.
Quite a lot of people would say that Rococo is the Baroque gone bad, and indeed that's the etymology of it, isn't it, essentially?
Indeed it is, yes. The name comes from this rather sort of crude attempt to mock the entire period. It comes from the French word rocaille, which means ornate shell work, that sort of stuff you get on fountains and grottos in Versailles. And then somebody put that together with Barocco, which is the original Portuguese word for the Baroque, and they created Rococo, with a sort of built-in giggle. Isn't that funny? We'll call it Rococo, because it's not serious, it's not proper art. My aim in this series is first of all to question the idea that art always has to be serious. And by that I mean it doesn't always have to be pious. It doesn't always have to have this enormous reverb to be great art. But also to show that the Rococo itself created lots of interesting things. It wasn't just a way of putting frames around ornate mirrors. It did a lot of other things. So the breadth was important to describe.
Your definition is partly temporal, but it's pretty generous in terms of the art. In your first episode, you described Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe as Rococo works. I dare say for the first time ever, and perhaps for the last time ever, so described those works. I mean, these are great works of the Protestant Enlightenment, aren't they? How can they be Rococo?
It's because they're about ideas of travel and travel in the imagination. And that first film is about travel, which was one of the great creative forces of the Rococo. I mean, not for one second do I say that people only began to travel in the Rococo, but it happened in ways that hadn't previously been possible. People went to Venice on a kind of holiday, didn't they? They didn't go in order to convert people as missionaries had gone. They didn't go as conquistadors to invade another country. They didn't go for wartime reasons. They went for the pleasure. So that became possible in Rococo times. And this journeying around, some of which was physical, but some of it was in the imagination. You know, if you look at chinoiserie, this great fondness for Chinese art that happens in Rococo times, none of these people have been to China. They just imagine this exotic kingdom full of amazing animals and wondrous palaces and rich potentates covered in silk. And then that freed the European imagination in return, and that's the point I try to make there. It's not that Gulliver's Travels is a Rococo work in the same way as a bit of Rococo architecture is, but that those ideas of travel that you get in Robinson Crusoe, that you get in the 1001 Arabian Nights, you know, that those ideas were ideas that made the Rococo possible.
Yeah, it does live in tandem with the Enlightenment, though, doesn't it? You describe it at one point as releasing the European id. So is the Enlightenment the superego? The superego is there saying, no, let's be rational, and the Rococo comes along and says, no, we'll fantasise.
Something like that, yes. I think that what's really interesting is that we think of this period as this great period of enlightenment and research, but if you actually look at the art, and art for me never lies. It always tells you the truth about a time, whether it means to or not. When you look at it, when you hear it, you know what's going on. And the art of the period tells another kind of story. It tells a story of people looking for pleasure. It tells, for example, in religious architecture, whereas Baroque architecture would try to sort of awe you into belief, or frighten you sometimes into listening to the priest. Rococo architecture delights you into belief. It seduces you into belief. It's another kind of strategy, but it works just as well. And when more and more people were pleased by it, it became more and more effective.
I'm going to throw Boucher at you, because you cannot stand on television and say Boucher is a great artist. You confess that you dislike his art yourself. What is he doing wrong with Rococo that, say, Balthasar Neumann, the great architect of these Rococo churches in Germany, gets right?
Well, perhaps a fairer comparison would be between Boucher and Watteau, because they're both painters, and Watteau to me is an artist who is both completely Rococo, but also shows these great Rococo depths that people don't usually expect of the period. So his art, he shows this fragile world full of lovers walking through gardens, listening to music, feeling and looking poetic, but at the same time there's this great vulnerability there. There's this sense always in Watteau that all this could disappear just like that these pleasures that are being offered here in the Rococo world are only very temporary and can go any minute. Well, you don't get any of that subtlety in Boucher. Boucher, you get these sort of colour-coded pink nudes. It's all about feasting the eyes on lots of pink boobs and bottoms. And as I say in the series, I mean, if you want, you know, it's the invention of page 3, really. I mean, it's the arrival in our culture of people who just get undressed because lots of other people are prepared to pay for it. There's no subtlety there. There's no poetry. And there's certainly no fragility.
Well, it's more is more for Boucher, isn't it? Which goes thoroughly against the grain of a kind of modernist attitude to art. I mean, that's one of its problems, the Rococo, isn't it? That it's struggling with minimalism and modernism still in art.
Well, yes, except the big point I'm trying to make is that the Rococo era basically invented us. I mean, most of the things you don't like about the Rococo, that's us. I'm sorry. Celebrity, nudes, frivolous soundscapes, you know, wherever you point in the Rococo, you see a kind of early form of us.
Peter Maxwell Davies, you love Borromini. Is there a cut-off point as the Baroque turns into Rococo for you?
It's, I think, less noticeable in Italy, particularly Rome, than it is further north. And I wouldn't say somebody like Cortona is a worse architect in many respects than Borromini or even Bernini. Came a little bit later, and they continued that tradition. And the real Rococo can be very frivolous, and I think to think about music at the period, and even more about art, it has got a sting in its tail because it was the time of the French Revolution, and also in Goya's work it became very, very dark.
Well, you go in, I think, don't you, in your...
You go into that.
My third film's all about the darkness of Rococo. Yes,
which
it has a bad ending.
Yes, but it makes one wonder what's going to happen now.
Well, it's because it's all being stoked up, isn't it? I mean, when you flee from reality as vigorously as the Rococo did, I mean, you're going to run into a brick wall sooner or later, aren't you?
But it has this worm in the bud from the very beginning, that it is prone to a kind of corruption and darkness, isn't it? Because
it is, but not all the artists notice that, of course, and the really great artists of the Rococo have it in their work. So if you look at Watteau, if you look at Chardin, if you look at Goya, they always seem to recognise that there is something being acted out around them that is fated to have a very dark ending, and that's indeed what my third film is about.
Victoria Williamson, I was interested. I mean, one of the things that people object to about the Rococo is the excess. You know, that there is just too much to look at. Similarly, with Rococo music, sometimes the ornamentation essentially takes over, and the object disappears. Is there any research into, as it were, the capacity of the human mind to take in detail? Is there a kind of upper limit?
Not one known. I suspect that if people were composing that kind of music, it was because they could perceive it themselves. As Sir Peter was saying earlier, it's a very motoric and physical sensation composition, and he can sense and feel the music himself. So that kind of human relationship with music is what makes it unique for us.
OK, well, we've run out of time to make noises ourselves. Thank you to all of my guests. Trevor Cox's Sonic Wonderland is out now, and Victoria Williamson's You Are the Music is published next month. Waldemar Januszak's series on Rococo continues on Tuesdays at 9 on BBC4, and you can hear the premiere of Sir Peter Maxwell Davies' 10th Symphony by the LSO at the Barbican in London on Sunday, and it's also going to be played live in concert on Radio 3 at 7:30. Next week, Anne McElvoy explores the worlds of secrets and spies with Luke Harding, Sir David Omand, Annette Ditaert and Alain de Botton. But for now, from us, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free. Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Like all radio studios, the one we're sitting in now has been deliberately constructed to dampen echoes and cut out extraneous sound, which means it's a drab sort of space for the acoustic engineer Trevor Cox, author of Sonic Wonderland. His quest for the world's most reverberant space has taken him into disused reservoirs and into underground oil bunkers, all part of a campaign to get us to pay more attention to the subtleties of our sonic landscape. His research into resonance and silence should generate an echo, though, from two of my other guests. The composer Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, whose 10th Symphony receives its premiere next Sunday, and the lecturer in music psychology Victoria Williamson, whose new book is about the ways in which music can shape us and the way our minds shape music. Also with us, the art critic Waldemar Januszak, whose television series Rococo argues that it's not all frills and froth. We begin, though, with one of the country's most distinguished composers, Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, Master of the Queen's Music, and you're about to premiere your 10th Symphony, which is a kind of very significant milestone in any composer's life, but particularly because of the curse of the ninth. I don't know whether you subscribe to that superstition. Verse true, is music a kind of mobile architecture?
It's hard to say, because I've loved architecture ever since I was a student in Rome. I first went there in 1955, and I was shown by an architect friend these wonderful buildings, and I immediately fell in love with Borromini, because he has this absolutely wonderful gift to be able to make a small space seem very large, with multiple dimensions, with almost as if there are different vanishing points in the building. And it reminds me in a strange way of Piranesi in some of his views of Rome, where he has different vanishing points, but even more so, those extraordinary fantasies about prisons where there are multiple vanishing points in the engraving. And I think it's very, very inspiring. And
did it inspire you in an impressionistic way, or are there more structural things that go into the symphony which are a reflection of what you see in Borromini?
Yes, there are actually therapy, and be at that table at 7 o'clock in the morning working, and I just had this huge determination. But
there wasn't a sense of mortality that affected how you wrote, or changed?
It's not really for me to say. And of course, the subject of the symphony is the architect Borromini, who, if you know anything about Rome, you will know.
I'm just going to move. You've got the score with you, and I'm just going to move it because it's tapping the microphone, which doesn't make me anxious, but makes them very anxious through the glass.
Anyway, I decided to write this symphony on Borromini, and I set in it for the chorus this dreadful anonymous sonnet against him. It's all in Italian. I thought with Papano conducting, and he's going to take it to Rome subsequently. So I thought, let's keep it all in the original Italian. And there's this wonderful, scurrilous sonnet against Borromini, accusing him of doing architecture which is against art and against nature. And who does he think he is? He thinks he's Bernini, but he's only fit to be a labourer on a site for Bernini.
Now, I know the critic, but you could be excused for doing it because you fell very, very ill last year, didn't you?
Well, this was extraordinary. I never thought about the Curse of the Ninth, and I had the idea for number 10, which was going to be played, I knew, the 2nd of February this year, and I was determined I was going to finish it. And then suddenly, last March, April, I became very ill and collapsed in the street, and life was very difficult. So I decided, very unusually, to go to see the doctor. And I couldn't believe it. They said, you've got to go to hospital now because you've got leukemia. Otherwise, you've got 6 weeks. So I went into the hospital, and while I was there, I wrote most of the symphony. So that if there is a Curse of Nine, that's one way of getting beyond it.
Well, you've magnificently defeated it, but I'm interested in the process. You must have been writing at a time when you were exhausted, when you were feeling ill. How did that feed into the music you wrote? Did you feel?
I hope not. I was determined to get up whenever I could with the dreadful chemo.
It doesn't get the last word in this piece,
no,
does it? Because you end with a litany of Borromini's churches,
yes,
the great masterpieces that have survived.
It finishes with Borromini's suicide note. He tried to commit suicide. It didn't work. He fell on his sword, and so he lived for 2 more days and dictated a kind of last testament, which I've set a part of, and it's very moving, and I think he was genuinely a very disturbed, introvert man who was desperately upset because Bernini got all the best commissions. And I set that for the soloist, the baritone soloist, and against that I've got the chorus chanting the names of the wonderful buildings that he either built himself or he had a hand in Rome, so that it finishes very quietly with the unaccompanied chorus, but on a positive note. This is the legacy. Isn't it wonderful? Is the last sentiment.
The triumph of art. It's very interesting that you've been so inspired by Borromini. There's that famous quote ascribed to Goethe. I don't know whether he actually said it. Architecture is frozen music.
Yes.
He's supposed to have said. Do you agree? And is the